The great New England preacher, Philip Brooks, was a great preacher, but he's actually better known now for one thing he did. He wrote a hymn called O Little Town of Bethlehem, but he was also a well-known preacher in his day. And he was often noted for just his quiet, his poise, his quiet personality, his peace about situations. And one day a friend saw him pacing back and forth, nervous, and he said, "What's troubling you, Dr. Brooks?" And Philip Brooks said, "The trouble is I'm in a hurry, and God is not." At another occasion, he said, "The hardest task in my life is to sit down and wait for God to catch up to me." I can tell by some of your laughter that you feel that way sometimes, don't you? You wonder what God's timing is, and you're waiting for Him. You're waiting for Him to catch up to you. God's timing isn't your timing. I'm that way. I know I'm often that way. I love the way that is expressed in Psalm 69. This has David's name on it, and it's a longer psalm, but down in verse 13, he says, "My prayer to you, O Lord, is this: at an acceptable time, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me according to your faithfulness." At an acceptable time. But it's just a couple verses later, in 17, he says, "Hide not your face from your servant, for I am in distress. Make haste to answer me." Isn't that how you feel sometimes? God, we want your timing, but hurry up. And you aren't alone. That's exactly how David felt in his situation. And so you aren't alone with that. And you know, it's okay to have that feeling and to express it to God. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be in the Psalms. And yet it's okay to have that feeling, to express it to God. But it's also easy for us sometimes to act on that feeling. And that's when we can get in trouble, is when we think God is being too slow and we act on that. When God's timing seems slow, that can be one of those things that can keep us from wholehearted devotion, is acting on, we think, God being too slow. That's something that King Saul demonstrated in his life, and we want to look today at the passage where that happened, and that's in 1 Samuel chapter 13. We've been studying this book together, going through it a story at a time and learning from it what we can learn. We began by looking at the life of Samuel, his miraculous conception, his birth, his life. And he was a prophet. He was also the judge of the nation of Israel. He was also a priest. He had all those roles. And he was the last judge of Israel, because that's when the nation started saying, we want a king. And so Samuel anointed the first king of Israel. His name was Saul. And up until this point of the story, everything that Saul has done has been really good. He seems to have done everything right, but when we get to this part of the story, his true character comes through. We see that he is a person that's not truly devoted to the Lord and isn't serving in that capacity. I just lost my thought. That's okay. Our story today is in chapter 13. I think it's kind of interesting that Saul's downfall is in chapter 13. That doesn't mean anything. It's just a good memory tool for us. And we just want to walk through this story today and see where Saul had his trouble. Now, remember what we looked at last week in chapter 12. A few chapters earlier, Saul had been anointed as king. In chapter 11, he went out and fought a war and had a great victory. In chapter 12, the nation and the army gathered together in one place. They celebrated the victory. And that's when Samuel stood up and gave his farewell speech to the country. I'm not the judge anymore, and so he's your king. And as we looked at that last week, we pointed out that he's talking about wholehearted devotion. And he gave us even some steps to wholehearted devotion that we looked at last week. But unfortunately, Saul doesn't do that. And so the very next chapter, and I think that God put it together this way, maybe the author of this book put it together this way to show us the contrast to what Samuel said and to Saul's life. And so that's in chapter 13. We're just going to kind of walk through a summary of the story and then go back and look at one lesson and some points to it that we can learn. And before we summarize the story, some of you might look at verse 1 and say, There's some different translations here. In fact, some of your Bibles will say dramatically different things than other ones. And so I want to take a moment just to talk about the trouble that's with verse 1. Because if you read it in its most literal way, this is what it would say. It was said, Saul was 1 year old when he became king, and he reigned in Israel for 2 years. Now, obviously, you know that's not right. And so translators do various things to try to figure out what that actually says. And there's one of three things they do, and that's why your translations might all be different. Some just leave it out altogether. Saul was blank years old, and he reigned a blank number of years. And we were talking about this last night in the manuscript game, and I said, I'm going to look at this verse tomorrow. And Roger Robbins said, that translation sounds like a punt. Just give up and not translate it, and that's really what it is. And I think the translators of the ESV got in trouble for it. So when they came out with a later edition, they put one of the other solutions in there. Another solution is to put some numbers in that we find in some very old translations from Hebrew into Syriac on this verse. And so some of your translations will say Saul was 31 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 42 years. It fills in the 30 and the 40. That's a possible solution. The way the numbers work out with his son Jonathan and everything else, those numbers probably aren't right, but that's a solution some offer. And other people turn the translation around completely, and this is what the ESV did. They say Saul lived for 1 year and became king, and when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, this is what happened. And the problem with that is every other time this construction is used in the Old Testament, it says how old the king was when he became king and how long he reigned. So we don't know if numbers were lost. We don't know if something different was meant by this. We really don't know. That's why all your translations might be different. But here's the thing to remember. It doesn't matter. It doesn't change the story at all. Okay? So when we talk about the points that we're going to talk about, that verse has no impact on it. So enough of that aside. Let's get down to the important stuff. The story really begins in verse 2. And it begins with Saul's son Jonathan defeating a garrison of the Philistines, their big enemy at the time. Here's how that happened. Saul had gathered a standing army of 3,000 chosen soldiers. You remember they called the whole nation to come to battle, and they won that victory on the east side of the Jordan. And then they gathered at Gilgal to celebrate that. And that's when Samuel gave his speech. And so what we understand happened is Saul would have sent most of the soldiers home. He handpicked 3,000 of them to stay as a standing permanent army. Excuse me. Now, the rest of those weren't rejected. Remember, this whole army was volunteers. And they had families and farms to take care of, so they were glad to go home, but they were on call. They could be called back to be in the army at any point. So he had these 3,000 soldiers. He put 2,000 of them under his command, and he put 1,000 of them under Jonathan's command, which is pretty amazing because Jonathan was born when Saul was 1 year old, and he was already an adult. So, no, that's why we know something was left out of the passage at some point in time. Jonathan and his 1,000 soldiers attacked this Philistine garrison that was in Israelite territory. Now, the word garrison can mean a fort with soldiers in it. It can also mean a house or an office of a military leader. It can mean the house or an office of a political leader. So we really don't know exactly what it is, but if it's a fort of soldiers, probably a smaller one. And anyway, Jonathan attacked it and defeated it. But the upshot of that is it made the Philistine nation mad. In fact, it says Israel was a stench to the Philistines. And so they began gathering their army to come and fight against Israel. And Saul's response was to prepare for battle as well. And so he sent word out to call the whole army back together. Now, because you read these all quickly together, it sounds like they went home and came immediately back. We don't know how much time transpired between these, and that could be what the 1 year means, but we don't know, or the 2 years means. But anyway, it was time for another battle, so Saul sent the word out around the nation, gathered an army for battle. And I want you to notice, this is where his true character begins to show. Because when he sends word out, here's what the Israelites hear. In verse 3, it says, Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land of Israel, saying, let the Hebrews hear. Verse 4, and all Israel heard that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. Who defeated the garrison? Jonathan. And what word went out is Saul defeated the garrison. You begin to see his true colors. Now, it was very common for kings to take credit for battles that their officers won. So maybe he thinks that's what he's doing, but still, he is taking credit for that battle. And then he brings the army together to prepare. And when they gather together, they see that they are way overpowered. Way overpowered. Verse 5 says, the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand of the seashore. And so a huge, huge army. And that's what the Israelites see. And because of that, some of them begin to flee. They were afraid of that gigantic army, and they began to desert Saul. Well, Samuel was supposed to come and offer a sacrifice to the Lord for the battle, and he was late in arriving. And so Saul just did Samuel's job for him. He offered the sacrifice that Samuel would have offered. And right as soon as he was done, Samuel got there. And it's interesting, there's no pleasantries between the two. Samuel walks in, he says, what have you done? He knew what had happened. He says, what have you done? He condemns Saul. He says, you've acted foolishly. Verse 13 is where everything in the book of 1 Samuel changes, where Saul's life begins to go downhill. Again, the number might be a good memory tool. 1 Samuel 13:13. This is what it says. It should be up on the screen there. Samuel said to Saul, well, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you, for then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. That's the beginning of the downfall of King Saul. He seemed to have taken things in his own hands. He didn't obey the command of the Lord, and so Samuel condemns him and calls him a fool. Now, that word foolish is a much stronger word in Hebrew that this was written in than our word foolish in English is. Because sometimes we think of foolish as not having much knowledge. We think of foolish as doing something silly. But foolishness in the Hebrew mind really means being morally and spiritually bankrupt. That's what it means, morally and spiritually bankrupt. So this is a very harsh criticism that Samuel gives to the king. Well, that's the story up to this point. But there's one big lesson I think it teaches us, and that is the factors that keep us from wholehearted devotion. Coming right off of this speech of Samuel, saying, here's how you're wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord. Saul gives us an example of just the opposite about that. And so he was not wholehearted devoted to the Lord. He was foolish. He was spiritually, morally bankrupt. And where you see all of these together, they're throughout this story, but where you see them all together is when Samuel first showed up in verses 11 and 12. I want to read these to you because all four of these factors are in there. And again, it's on the screen if you want to follow there. Samuel said, what have you done? And this was Saul's answer. When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines were mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. Notice a couple of words while that passage is up there. The first thing he says is, I saw the people were scattering. He felt abandoned. The next thing he says is, you didn't come at the right time. The timing wasn't right. It wasn't my timing. The third thing he says is, the Philistines were mustering this giant army at Michmash. By the way, he was He was at Gilgal, and Michmash is just right across the deep valley. They could see each other with this deep valley in between. He knew exactly what was going on over there. He could see that. And there's that fear that comes in. And then he says, we hadn't sought the Lord, so I forced myself to offer a burnt offering. And we see there the taking things in his own hands and thinking he's above the law. And those are 4 factors that can keep us from devotion. So what I want to do is walk through each of those and just see how they play a part in this story and maybe understand how we can avoid those. So the first one I want to come to talk about is fear. Fear. When I saw the Philistines had mustered an army, verse 5 again says, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand of the seashore. Now, again, there's one of these scribal variances. Some of the old copies say 3,000 chariots. Some say 30,000. The areas there would have a hard time holding 30,000 chariots, but the significant thing is this army was huge. And chariots were state-of-the-art technology. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. And so this is what they saw. They saw this huge army. Here's some history that'll help with this. This was right at the time when the world was changing from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. The Philistines had iron. The Israelites did not. The Philistines were far more technically advanced than Israel was. Sometimes we think of Israel with their following the one true God being the really advanced society. But at this point in time, it was the Philistines. They had iron. The Israelis did not. And it's interesting. I mean, if you take a spear of iron or a sword of iron, it can go right through a helmet of bronze or a shield made out of bronze. And so this army was way overpowered. And the Philistines controlled the iron trade in the area. In fact, if you go down to verse 19, there's a little section there that explains this whole thing. It says, there was no blacksmith to be found throughout the whole land of Israel, for the Philistines had said, lest the Hebrews make for themselves swords and spears. We want to control this part of the world, so we're not going to let them have any blacksmiths. So when the Israelites needed farm tools or needed their farm tools sharpened, they had to go down to the cities of the Philistines to get their tools sharpened, because they didn't have anything to do it with. And it goes on to talk about that. It was quite expensive for them. And then in verse 22, it says, so on the day of battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, except for Saul and his son Jonathan. So here's this army of the whole nation of Israel. They had 2 swords and 2 spears that were made out of iron. And they're facing this giant army that is made of that. Not only that, they had chariots made of iron. Let me tell you what a chariot was. A chariot was in hand-to-hand battle in those days what a tank is today. I mean, it couldn't be defeated because it was iron and they didn't have anything to knock out the iron with. I mean, basically what we see is an army with guns and tanks going against an army with sticks and garden rakes. And that's what's going on here. And it's no wonder the people were afraid. It's no wonder that Saul himself was afraid. And in verse 7, it says the people who followed Saul were trembling. He didn't do anything to encourage them. And so we see the fear with him as well. How often do we feel fear over what we think or where we think God might be leading us? How often do we feel that? A few years ago, our Converge Worldwide, the denomination we're a part of, had their worldwide meetings in Littleton. So since they were nearby, I got to go. And the man who was the president of our denomination at the time, Scott Rideout, gave a talk called 8 Issues Facing American Churches Today. I won't give them all to you, but here's some of the 8 issues. He said, focus on growth is outpacing focus on health. Churches today are more interested in getting big than in being healthy. And it's no wonder we have some big churches that are very shallow. His third one was retaining is prioritized over sending. It's more important for us to keep our crowd of people than to minister to the world. Number 8 was practice is emphasized over prayer. We'd rather be out doing things than seeking God. But number 7 was this: fear has eclipsed faith as our operating mode. Fear has eclipsed faith as our operating mode. We operate out of a fear of what can go wrong rather than faith in where God is leading us as a church. And that happens in churches today. I want you to think again about that word foolish. Excuse me. I did a word study on this, and I'm going to quote you a paragraph that comes from a tool called the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament. And let me tell you what this is. This is the really high-up scholars that have all the advanced degrees studying these words together, and sometimes they write like that. But every once in a while, they come up with these really profound things they say in common English. This is what the author of the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament said about this word foolish. He said, the verb, in particular, is mostly used in contexts where a man acts out of fear. Foolishness is when we act out of fear. He says, thus he behaves rashly rather than acting wisely out of confidence in God. It's foolish because it seeks our security apart from God. This is practical atheism, living by one's own resources without dependence on God. But that is the essence of sin. Wow, that's amazing. He was called foolish because he was acting out of fear. And he was relying on his own resources rather than faith in God. The opposite of faith often isn't unbelief. The opposite of faith is often fear. We're afraid to act on what we believe God might be leading. So fear. The second one is feeling abandoned. People were scattering from me, so I had to do something. In verses 6 and 7, it says that when the people of Israel saw that they were in trouble, they hid themselves in the caves and in the holes and in the rocks and in the tombs. And some of them crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Now, if you remember a couple of chapters ago, there was a battle on the east side of the Jordan in East Israel that Saul and his army won. So East Israel was a free place. They didn't have enemies. And that's where the army was fleeing. Because now we're back in the west. They're going across the Jordan. It's safe over there. We've already defeated the enemies. Let's go over there. We don't want to deal with this huge Philistine army. And so it's no wonder that he was feeling abandoned. When it finally came time for battle, look at the end of verse 15. Saul had about 600 men. Now wait a minute. He had 2,000 with him. Jonathan had 1,000 with him. Maybe they were cut off and couldn't get there. Saul sent out word for the whole nation to come, and they started coming. Maybe they were cut off. Let's give them a benefit of the doubt. Maybe they were cut off and couldn't get there. But still, 1,400 of Saul's 2,000 handpicked men left. It's no wonder he was feeling abandoned. It's no wonder. Have you ever felt like you're all by yourself doing God's work? Have you ever felt that way? Like everybody's left. What am I supposed to do? You aren't alone. You aren't alone. Elijah felt that way. Elijah was out in the wilderness and he said, God, I'm the only one left to worship you. They're all worshiping Baal. And God said to him, I have 3,000 people who have not bowed their knee to Baal. You aren't alone, Elijah. Go do what I called you to do. He did. Saul didn't, unfortunately. So there's fear, there's feelings of abandonment. The next one is a delay in God's timing, is where we started today. Verse 8, Samuel didn't come at the appointed time. Verse 11, Saul's answer, when I saw that the people were scattering and that you did not come within the days that were appointed, I took things in my own hands. Now, just a little technical note here. Some people connect this to chapter 10, verse 8, because in that chapter, Samuel, right after he anointed Saul, said, go to Gilgal and wait 7 days and I'll come and make a sacrifice. But to do that, you have to rearrange the whole order of the book, and it doesn't work very well. Rather than doing that, it's easier just to say, apparently, Samuel and Saul had a prearranged agreement that when you send out for the army or when you send out for the nation to gather, for some reason, wait 7 days, and I'll get there. And then we'll offer a sacrifice, we'll worship the Lord, and then you can go to war or whatever you're going to do. There was probably some sort of a prearrangement like that, but Samuel didn't come in those 7 days. Unlike Phillips Brooks, Saul couldn't sit down and wait for God to catch up with him. He had to run ahead and play the fool instead. In his book, Desiring God, John Piper says these words. By the way, it's one of the most influential books I've ever read. I have a list of like the 10 most influential books, and that's on it. But this is what he said. He says, God aims to exalt himself by working for those who wait for him. Prayer is the essential activity of waiting for God. It acknowledges our helplessness and his power. It calls upon him for help, seeking his counsel. That's what prayer is. God is great and we are not. God is powerful, we are helpless. That's why we have prayer. But prayer is the antidote for the disease of self-confidence that opposes God's goal by getting glory and by working for those who wait for him. God's goal is to work through people and glorify himself through his work. But when we don't wait on him, he can't do that. And so the antidote to being in a hurry is sitting down and praying. God, show me your way and allow me to wait patiently for you, something that Saul couldn't do. And then the fourth one. And this is a big one in my mind. I call it self-exceptions. Making an exception to God's rules for yourself. Rather, you are the thinking, acting like you're the exception to the rule, like you are above the law of God. Saul thought probably, I'm the king. I can do this myself. I don't need Samuel here. And so he took and offered the sacrifice. I have to laugh at what he said to Samuel when he was making his excuses. He said, I forced myself to offer a sacrifice. I forced myself. I didn't really want to do it, but I did. It's such a crazy, ridiculous exaggeration. Some people think he had a priest there that offered the sacrifice and he just was ahead of Samuel. Most people think there wasn't a priest there, that Saul took things in his own hands and did what God said should be only the prerogative of the priest. Either way, Saul is running ahead because he's not waiting on what God told him through the prophet. Wait till I get there and I will offer the sacrifice. And that was something he wasn't willing to do. He was disobedient to God's word through his prophet. You know, he probably didn't see it as a big deal. Why is Samuel making a mountain out of a molehill? We hadn't offered anything to the Lord. We're ready to go to battle. We offered a sacrifice. What's the big deal? But it really does reveal the heart of Saul. It reveals that his agenda was the most important thing. It was far more important than God's rules and God's agenda. And he was saying, my agenda is more important. It doesn't apply to me. That's the ultimate in pride. God's word doesn't apply to me. Unfortunately, I've seen this all my life in all kinds of areas. I've seen it in politics. I've seen it in relationships. I've seen it in business. I've seen it in politics. All three of our last three presidents have thought themselves above the law. I don't care what party you're from or who you voted for or didn't vote for. All three of them were that way. And in fact, I think about 4 of the last 6 were that way. You know, they saw themselves above the law. I see it in business. You know, the ends justifies the means. We're accomplishing something great here, so it doesn't apply to us. I see it all the time in relationships, unfortunately, especially sexual relationships. You know, we've prayed about this. We're engaged. We're getting married. It's okay to live together. I see that kind of thing all the time. It's putting ourselves above God's law. I see it in pastors all the time. They somehow think they're okay. They're going to be good because God's working through them. And if you read Christian news, you see pastors who are failing morally or embezzling from the church or doing these things on a daily basis. It's sad to see. One city council was looking for a new city manager, and they were interviewing the candidates, and they brought one particular candidate in, and he was sitting around the table with them in a conference room, and they were asking him the various questions they would ask. And finally, one councilman looked at him and he said, "What's 2 + 2?" And the candidate looked around at all the men, and he got up and he shut the blinds on the window, and he checked the door to make sure it was locked, and he sat down, he said, "What do you want it to be?" They hired him on the spot. That's not a true story. It just brings out a point that we get in certain positions and we think we're above the truth. We think we're above the law. We think we can get away with whatever. And it is a killer to that wholehearted devotion to God, because wholehearted devotion follows God's word and keeps his word. So Saul is not a good king to follow, not the kind of example that we want. We need a king who doesn't falter. And the reason we do is because we struggle with these same four things, don't we? We have trouble waiting on God. We sometimes think we're the exception. We see things that make us fearful. We see times when we feel abandoned. We struggle with these same things. So we need a king who doesn't struggle with these. We need one who's worthy of being followed. And Jesus is that kind of king. Jesus is that kind of king. Consider Jesus for a minute. He was misunderstood. Nobody believed who he was. Even his closest followers didn't understand why he came. He kept telling them, "I came to die," and they didn't get it. He was misunderstood. He faced a far greater fear than Saul faced. Saul faced an army of thousands of chariots. He could have ran away. Jesus faced certain death, and the most agonizing kind of death that we know of. He faced it with certainty. It's no wonder he said, "Lord, if possible, let this cup pass from me." He knew what fear was. He was abandoned. You know, when Jesus was arrested, every one of his followers fled. None of them were left. He was abandoned. But that's not the worst abandonment he faced. Did I say that word right? Abandonment? That's not the worst that he faced. Because when he was on the cross, God the Father left him, turned his face away, as we sometimes sing, because of the sin that was put on Jesus. And that's why Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That eternal relationship between Father and Son had never been broken, and it was broken for a time. That is far more abandonment than any of us could ever face. And ultimately, as you know, he was killed. He suffered to the point of death, even death on a cross. Jesus was misunderstood. He faced a great fear. He was abandoned. He was killed. But he endured patiently. That's where he differs from Saul. He endured patiently. He didn't open his mouth at trial. He was like a lamb led to the slaughter. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He wasn't being judged justly at all, but he entrusted himself to God who does judge justly because he knew God's plan. He endured. He never faltered. He never faltered. He faced opposition from sinful men and never gave in to it. He was tempted in all things as we are, yet he is without sin. That's why he prayed, "Not my will, but yours be done." Lord, let this cup pass from me, but your will and not mine. He never faltered, and he never made himself an exception. You know, if anybody ever had a right to make himself an exception to the rules, it was Jesus. But he never did. If anybody had a right to say this is an unfair trial and appeal it, he did, but he didn't. He was faithful even to the point of death. Though he existed in the form of God, he didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He took on the form of a bondservant, was made in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's the Jesus that we worship. That is a king that we can trust and follow. Saul was not a very good king. He was not a very good example. He started out well, but he didn't finish well. But Jesus is the king we can follow and turn to. There's another king who trusted the right king. His name is Martin Luther King. In January of 1956, during the Montgomery boycott, he was threatened with his life. One night he said, "I couldn't sleep. A threatening phone call had terrified me, and I prayed, 'Lord, here I am. I'm taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I'm terrified. The people are looking for me for leadership, and if I stand before them without the strength and courage, they too will falter. I'm at the end of my powers, and I can't face it alone.'" You see, he faced fear of death. He faced abandonment. Most of the churches had abandoned him, even though now they look back and say he was right. Later he wrote, "At that very moment, I experienced the presence of the divine as I have never experienced him before. It seemed as though I could hear the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, 'Stand up for righteousness, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever.' And almost at once, my fears began to go, and my uncertainty disappeared." We often face fear, abandonment, feelings that we're above the law, and delay in God's timing. But we can turn to the true King, Jesus Christ.